Hello, everyone. Welcome back to STATEC Research's seminar series on measuring progress and well-being. I'm Kelsey O'Connor, one of the organizers. I hope you had a nice summer. As many of you know, we hosted our first annual workshop on measuring progress. The event was opened by the Luxembourg Minister of the Economy, Franz Fayot, and followed by 24 plenary sessions and 2 keynote speeches by Carrie Exton and Martin Binder. If you're interested, you can see the recordings of each of those presentations on our YouTube page. And if you don't have our YouTube page, I can put a link to it. And you can also find it in our emails and online. Today, we are pleased to welcome Dr. Christopher Barrington-Leigh. He's going to discuss subjective well-being as the central goal for government. How, why, and why not? Quite. So it's a question. How should subjective well-being be used as the central goal? Chris will speak for approximately 40 minutes and then address questions at the end, at which time please raise your virtual hands or post your questions in the chat. During the presentation, please keep your microphones muted. Also, it's a good idea to keep cameras off to save bandwidth, although you can turn them on if you're asking a question at the end. And a last reminder, we are recording the event. You'll be able to find this and past recordings on the website and the YouTube channel. Now to introduce Dr. Christopher Barrington-Leigh. So Christopher is Associate Professor at McGill University in Montreal, Canada. His research has a focus on empirical and quantitative assessments of human life satisfaction and their implications for economic, social, and environmental policy. He uses large international as well as national surveys, experiments, and economic modeling to understand individual, community, and global happiness. He teaches courses on the economics of well-being and on environmental economics. Chris has a unique educational background. Before training as an economist at the University of British Columbia, he trained in upper atmospheric and space plasma physics at MIT, Stanford, and Berkeley. Personally, I'm happy he joined us, came over to the dark side in economics to study well-being. Much of his current work overlaps with our goals to better measure social progress. So I'm happy he joined us. And beyond his talk today, I recommend checking out this work. You can find them on Google Scholar, among other places, the typical spots. So without further ado, we are pleased to welcome Dr. Christopher Barrington-Leigh. Chris, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much to Kelsey and STATEC. This is a great honor. I'm thrilled to be with all of you virtually. So in principle, there are only 2 slides I want you to remember. So I may move fast through bits of the presentation, and I'll try to remember to highlight the things that I really trying to get across. Kelsey asked for this to be targeted broadly, but also research-based, and so that there is some of this. I'd look for the discussion because some of this may sound like opinion or heaven forbid philosophy. Okay, so I just want to start by showing a little bit of some work that came out in the World Happiness Report in 2022. And this is just to give a sense that there's a growth in interest in a popular sense in subjective well-being. And then I'll talk about what's happening in governments, and I'll give you the framework I think about, that I use to think about the role of subjective well-being in policymaking as an academic. Okay, so and as advertised in the title, I want to explain my reservations, or at least, yeah, so partly reservations and partly constructive cautions, I think. Okay, so coming back to what I thought I was showing you, which was just to start by looking at some popular trends. This is a measure of how these terms are used in the written word in English. So using the Google Books, Scanned Books Archive, this shows that since 2013, the use of the word happiness has occurred more frequently as a fraction of all words than the phrase gross domestic product, which you might say is an older marker of progress. In fact, the mention of GDP has been declining since 2010. And even more stark is if you look at the trend in the mention of income. You can see a multi-decade trend of decreasing use which peaked around 1980 and has halved in relative usage since 1995. Here are some more related terms. I'll skip that, but this is not just a feature of English. So actually a lot of the world's books are in English, it turns out, but these are the other languages that Google has scanned. And you can see that the trends I just showed you are fairly consistent across languages. Again, this is showing the relative incidence of different translations of happiness in these 7 languages. Similarly, a declining focus on economic growth is visible across languages. This is also true of income. And this is, I don't have very insightful comments on this, but for interest, here's what's happened to the phrase quality of life, which actually my country, as I'll show you in a moment, has chosen to capture the concept, but it's actually on decline again across a number of languages. So I'll be focusing on subjective well-being and happiness, and in particular life satisfaction, as I'll make clear in a moment. And another interesting lens on society is to look at academic research. So here we find similar trends in terms of growing interest in happiness, and this is the fraction of publications which mention life satisfaction or subjective well-being or happiness either in their titles or their abstracts in 2 different research fields and also across all fields. And again, this is not showing you the growth of the number of publications, which continues to be much faster than this even. This is a log scale, but this is the growth in the fraction of those publications which have these terms in them. Now, I find this especially interesting. Here we're looking exclusively at those academic studies that are in economics-related journals and which contain our happiness-related terms. So just within that subset of all the publications, this is looking at the relative, at the fraction of those which has each of these terms. And so my takeaway here is that there's some maturation from the somewhat amorphous term of happiness, which can mean different things in different contexts, to the slightly more technical terms of subjective well-being and life satisfaction within economics. I would take as people become familiar with the with the differences with the terms and with the research. Okay, now let's look at econ in a bit more detail, and let's look at absolute numbers of publications now. This is showing that, well, here's my most interesting point in this plot. There's growth in each of these categories here, and in particular, let's look at the happiness, etc., which again means life satisfaction, subjective well-being, or happiness mentioned in the title of the abstract within all of the economics-related journals. And so that seems to continue to be growing exponentially in absolute terms. True also if I look for the combination of those terms with policy, so publications that have at least some claimed connection to practice. But here's what happens if I just look at the top 20, econ top 20, which is some subjectively defined list, or the econ top 5, which is a list that everybody sort of agrees on. And there actually, the numbers are not growing. They've essentially come down from, this is 10 per year at the peak here, to just less than 1 per year in the top 5. So this seems like a topic for a different time, but I'm mentioning it because, well, why is this happening? It could be because we're not producing novel or good research or anymore, or the standard for causal identification has gone up over time or something like that, or because there's still somewhat of a dysfunctional filter against this field. So, and that seems like a topic for a different time, but I'm mentioning it because training more economists in the field is actually going to be critical to shifting policy making processes and capacities. And it seems from what I'll show you next that economics is going to be pulled from the outside into taking this field more seriously still. so that would be an interesting debate for some forum sometime. My own anecdotal view, well, my own experience, first of all, is that 15 years ago I was told that it was okay to write my economics dissertation on happiness as long as I understood that when I graduated I would be unemployable. And today the interest is higher, the familiarity is higher. I mean, interest from say incoming students, familiarity in the profession is higher, but I'm not sure the costs to young researchers are all that different, in that it's, you know, it's not looked well on, and it's a risk. So, okay, I wanted to say that, but it's well, I've made it somewhat relevant to policy. That's just the same log scale in case. Okay, so this is surely not necessary with this crowd, but just to be very clear, I am going to be focusing particularly on life satisfaction with life. You know, in economics has done this in the context of subjective well-being, has done this. What I mean is economics has particularly privileged and focused on this question in research. A psychologist might tell you that subjective well-being, or the overarching kind of subjective well-being, equally includes the affective, positive affect, high positive affect, low negative affect, and this kind of cognitive evaluation. But this doesn't need to be my call. I'm going to appeal to what governments are doing in embracing these and bringing them into policy. So this is the question, and here's the first slide that I said I wanted you to remember. So let me spend a bit of time explaining what I often call the three different possible roles for life satisfaction in guiding governance. And well, have modesty around this because this is very academic. So the first thing is as just being present, in particular as a headline indicator. It has value in communicating the overall intent and possibly accountability of a government. And it may even help to define or suggest an identity for, you know, what is society supposed to be doing. So if you put something like life satisfaction at the top of your budget or your national indicators, then you know, then you're conveying these things. You're saying this is what we value ultimately is building better lives, and this is how the government should be held account. So it could also have policy impacts, you know, from sort of a science communication point of view. Just thinking about understanding and seeing a bit of the data without asking yet what should be done to improve life satisfaction, just actually the concept can be powerful enough to get policymakers to think differently about you know, constitutional kind of things about what are the objectives or frameworks with which government should be making policy and measuring programs. There's something else I think recently come to think is well, maybe it's lingo. I haven't heard the lingo of positive policy, but we have this tradition in psychology of focusing on negative symptoms, on pathologies, and we have this tradition in health of doing that. And so our whole field of analysis comes out of positive psychology. So positive policy making really means, and oh, I said psychology and health. I should separately probably say mental health. We still use mental health as a euphemism when almost exclusively it actually means mental illness or mental suffering. So there's this idea that in all of these domains of life, we have somehow built a system of indicators and emphases of where we put our resources that are around problem solving when things have gone badly enough. And so an important question is, I mean, I don't fully understand why. There must be some reason, good reason for that. But it seems that positive policy making is maybe framing things in a positive way is actually quite novel and maybe quite powerful. So it's not just about communicating human-centered accountability, which I think is already profound from the point of view of somebody who thinks there's a lot of focus on, on GDP or these really economic accounting kind of measures. It's about reorientation to positive objectives. And, this may be the part I'm most confident about, in a sense, in that I think having positive goals is really important for people, important for policy, important for society. It makes policy and makes change and the whole direction of society. In the strongest case, I would say it makes it deliberate as opposed to reactive, right? So otherwise, one's vision is defined by the problems that you're experiencing at the moment, or tends to be. And so this is also associated with the valuing the process of visioning and backcasting to get to your policies in policymaking, as opposed to predict and provide, thinking about as I said, the current problems in the next 5 years and the current trends and so on. So possibly in this sense, broader conceptions of well-being, broader measures of well-being, other than the cognitive evaluations, or even other than having a scalar for it, can play somewhat the same role in that non-subjective well-being measurements, even of outcomes, can change mission statements or frameworks just by people seeing some novel or well-presented data. So moving on then from that to the second role, which becomes maybe more specific to subjective well-being and life satisfaction. And the second role is to provide an organizing concept for a more concrete measurement framework, concrete objective measurement framework, say. And I'll show you some from some central governments in a moment. So subjective well-being can be used to determine the structure of an indicator dashboard, and moreover, to have some empirical accountability to it, or possibly even to an index of objective indicators. So in the, at the first level here, if I have a headline indicator of subjective well-being, it can give me guidance based on evidence as to what else should be in the indicator set. Going further, and what should maybe be removed, right? And quantifying that a little more continuously, it may tell me how much to weight different indicators. And one version of that would be that I have a dashboard of indicators, objective indicators, and I build an index out of them. But instead of using completely unaccountable arbitrary weights, I could use weights that are informed by the evidence and subjective well-being. The advantage of having an index made from objective indicators as opposed to subjective well-being is that I might have them from administrative data, or they might be cheaper to measure, or I have high frequency of measurement and so on. Okay, so why is all of that useful? Having rationalizability for a for dashboard does a couple of things. One is that it makes it, well, the Canadian government calls theirs evergreen. It means that in principle, this is something that's going to be updated. So that in turn makes it probably more politically sustainable, in the sense that the details of a dashboard, or definition of a dashboard, are not tied as much to a particular political administration, because because they are in flux and accountable to some rationalizable process. Now, I put objectives versus determinants here. This is something that seems to be, in my ability to understand some of the way, especially in the public realm of public health, in the way that objectives are communicated now and related to determinants, it can be quite confusing. And so even if we don't yet have the knowledge to make policy based on the data very specific to subjective well-being, if we have a system to rationalize a dashboard of measures or objectives, we at least know in principle why we're pursuing those goals, right? So those objective or those sub-indicators or objective indicators may be more closely linked to the levers of resource allocation or power, or they may be easier to measure. And just making clear what is a determinant and what is an objective in principle, I think can be very powerful. And that's in part for the next item here, which is that right now, policy is made in all of these silos. And so if you are trying to justify or fund a program, it's difficult to evaluate the benefits which would accrue to a different department's domain. And, you know, and I mean, the only competing thing actually is something like, you know, economic production or something as an outcome. So there's the potential in principle here, and this will now blend into the third role, but there's a potential to really allow governments to have a more synergistic way to evaluate and plan their policies. So then thirdly, taking this the next step in terms of the science, one can actually be quantitative about what one expects in terms of outcomes of a proposed program expenditure policy on subjective well-being of the population in quantitative terms. And of course that, you know, it's not actually the importance for subjective well-being that one ultimately worries about, but the cost effectiveness of the policy. In other words, you ultimately interested in the things that you can change, how those affect life satisfaction. So this means we can be quite quantitative in setting up a cost-benefit framework based on life satisfaction, subjective well-being. And the important thing about all of that is that you need a scalar to do that in a sort of narrow-minded economics way of thinking about it. You can't maximize an objective if it's not a scalar. So that maybe explains some of what's happened in terms of the take-up. Okay, so this is a bit of a busy plot, but this is from a database we built in 2016 and updated for 2022 of 166 indicator systems around the world used to measure overall well-being or progress. And the difference between the thick lines and the thin lines here reflects how long new indicators last. So the thin lines show the creation of new indicators, while the thick lines show how many are still in use. And for all I'm talking about here, you should look at the right-hand scale, which is the cumulative and ongoing number of initiatives in each decade. So this is a big, busy figure, but the point is that the subjective well-being indicators that are in red here seem to stick around more as compared with the these blue and green pairs, where it looks like people are steadily coming up with new indices, which is this, but they disappear as fast as they're created, which is why these are fairly flat. And you know, in this work, I argue that if you have arbitrary weights in an index, or you have the word indicator here, by the way, means basically a dashboard, or you have a dashboard which is not empirically accountable, it's not likely to stick around. It's not likely to gain political traction without some rationalization. Okay, so that's sort of circumstantial evidence for this new class of indicators having some staying power. And then just to move on to what this looks like in some central governments. You're all familiar with these 2012 guidelines from the OECD. They've recently looked at what influence they've had. And I'm sure, as you know, they're going through multiple processes at the moment in updating and expanding the depth of these. But they found that more than 70% of OECD countries have developed national frameworks to do with well-being. And 90% of them collect life satisfaction that looks kind of like the OECD's suggested canonical phrasing. And 80% of countries are doing that annually or more frequently. They also have this categorization of the link between measurement and policy use, and it looks, I suppose, a little bit like my 3 roles. In fact, the Nordic Council has a similar kind of ranking of to what extent these measures are being used. So I'll show you now 3 or 4 examples of countries in category 4 in their ranking, and I'll also show you what category 5 looks like. So here's the UK, which is selling their subjective well-being data as quarterly estimates, which is very nice because it fits with what with old-fashioned national statistics or ongoing national statistics. But the point is that it's important that they're on the press's calendar, because otherwise people might only pay attention once. But if you're expecting these numbers to come out, then it's your duty to report and interpret them. So here, I'm sure you've seen, but this is their dashboard, and you have life satisfaction at the top here of personal well-being. Okay, and a number of other subjective measures. Another thing going on in the UK that I noticed from the National Infrastructure Commission's Quality of Life discussion paper that I really like is that while they have their objective measures that they directly affect, that they have expert knowledge on how their domain affects, they go down the causal accountability, the accountability path here, which ultimately is justifying what they're doing in terms of quality of life. And I particularly like it, I particularly like seeing that health is subsidiary to quality of life, but this is the kind of ultimate justification, even if this is not particularly informing your quantitative policy making at the moment, it fits into this framework. Okay, here's another country. My own, in 2021, they came up with this quality of life framework with 5 different domains of measurables. The framework's supposed to be evergreen, so these may change with time. There's a couple of things I really like about it, and one is that they have this overarching measure of subjective well-being, life satisfaction, and they also have a eudaimonia measure in here. And the other, this relates to what I'll come back to in the end, is that they don't include measures of inequality of distribution in the domains or in the measures of quality of life, nor do they include sustainability. So tangible environmental outcomes are in there affecting current quality of life, but they instead use these lenses of sustainability and fairness that are cross-cutting. In any case, they have a dashboard that's also got life satisfaction. Where is that? As the first item. And as of a few months ago, Australia has a very similar looking framework. And again, overall life satisfaction sits above, as this overarching indicator, above 5 domains that look quite similar. And in fact, they have this lens here, just like Canada came up with. And so their dashboard looks familiar. And the last example I'm going to give is New Zealand. And you might be seeing a pattern here of Anglophone countries. They don't have that same kind of framework, but the 2020, page 2, literally page 2 of the budget in 2021 is all about the status of life satisfaction across different groups in the country. And the first page of text in the 2022 budget, and this is after COVID, mentions mortality first, and in the next sentence, life satisfaction. So that's sort of the role 1 in my roles. Okay, and let me move through this maybe faster than I have been going. The next step, this third role for life satisfaction, is really getting into the quantitative cost benefit. And so there's these frameworks of WALLIs and WellBees. Here's an example of WellBees being used to actually make policy decision, suggested policy decision, applied to a policy decision. And here's a government that has actually, this is as close, I think, as we have an example of this third role of subjective well-being getting into the government machinery. Okay, it's also happening, there's policy not just in government, but in the voluntary sector, and this seems to be a big thing as well, where people are using this third role, the quantitative cost-benefit analysis, to think about where best to put money. Okay, the one more thing I want to mention before I get on to the other important slide is how do we what is the future of the evidence on life satisfaction that is actually going to be someday useful for widespread decision making that goes beyond these case 1, case 2 kind of influence on policy. I call these databases of happiness coefficients, and this just means systematic survey kind of work, compiling information across studies in some way which is nested geographically, so that we have evidence that's more relevant to a particular geography, somehow privileged, but still leveraging information from the broader evidence that we have worldwide. That screams out to me for some kind of a new Bayesian framework to integrate all that we know. And yet, you might say that there's a very small number of studies that meet the kind of causal identification standards that we would like to have for policymaking in this field. So how do we set up a system where we are properly representing and accounting for our causal confidence in these values and integrating them across lots of studies? And I think, in the optimistic case of where this field is going in terms of policy impacts, I think that's an unsolved problem, to think about how to do that. Here's just some examples of what those numbers look like. Okay, so here are what I think of as challenges to the idea that well-being should be the primary goal of government, and that language is used by in a number of places, a number of people in our field, and I think that can get us into trouble in a couple of ways. And one of them, I'm spelling out a lot of sort of obvious things here, but and one of them is that the science doesn't tell us how to aggregate across distributions. It doesn't give us a collective welfare function. Just to beat that horse so it's dead, right? I mean, well, in our conception, well-being is very much an individualized thing. This is not something that is common. That's not obvious to people across different fields. In economics, a societal well-being is absolutely only the sum of the individual well-beings that individuals experience. Only individuals experience well-being, and by the way, if you try and represent it as a mean, nobody's experiencing the mean well-being, just like no one experiences the mean income exactly. So we're talking about measures of things that are very much at an individual level of experience. So what do we do then? How do we make decisions? They should in principle be over the distributional outcome. In other words, if I have a policy, well, I've got pictures for this, right? So here's the fear some people have. So some people both fantasy and fear. Some people fantasize a future that looks like this, where we just have a fairly mechanical thing where we're optimizing well-being somehow. But of course, to many, this is terrifying. And so that's completely unrealistic. And to state this obvious thing about welfare functions, right? If this is the current state of, if this is the current distribution of life satisfaction, and I have a policy which I put through all of my predictive evaluations, and I think this is going to be the new distribution. It's got a higher average, but there are some people who seem to be worse off. And so it's not obvious what to do. And of course, even more so if I happen to know that there's a subset of, like a visible or a demographic subset which has our attention, which is going to do, on average, worse off by this policy. Okay, so in some sense, our science should end at generating distributions. And of course, we're all statistically mostly modeling means. So we, in principle, at some point, somebody's got to aggregate if they want to scale it to make a decision. But the evidence should really be focused on generating distributions, and maybe even publicly. So these kind of dashboards should not be telling us what the average is, because that's not really a very meaningful thing to work on for these individually experienced measures. Okay, that's this distributions problem. The second problem is to do with sustainability. So, but I'm saying these are things that people in our field are not properly acknowledging. We talk a lot about really being able to optimize a scalar, which ultimately is average life satisfaction. And I don't know how we deal with the fact that that's we can't really do that honestly, and what we do when we can't. Ultimately, policymakers, political debate, all of the public discourse has to happen around distributions. Okay, secondly, when I say sustainability, I mean, I'm defining it for a moment as the policy questions and the problems that relate to the far future, or complex systems, or systems characterized by high uncertainty. So that's not the classic way that you would maybe define sustainability. But here's my point. If I have a decision like this to make between where I should put my budget, the life satisfaction, if I have enough knowledge about how all of these investments propagate through the life course, and I want to look at payoffs in 1 generation or something, I could probably do that. I can convert them into life satisfaction, and I can, on that basis, choose which one of these 2 things to do. As I said, even if it's over, say, a life course. But if instead I need to make a decision about spending on those investments versus spending on something like climate change mitigation, which that's even not a great example, because maybe because the problems are so acute. So I'll give you some other crazier examples very briefly in a moment. But the problem I have then is that one side of my equation is completely dominated by uncertainty. And if I now want to choose whether to allocate the next $100 million to the right or the left, I cannot use math to make the decision. That's a funny way to phrase it. But the point is, I won't even be able to make the decisions about those 2 alternatives I just saw for the present, because every single decision I make is going to be dominated by this uncertainty. And so we really need to appeal to some other principle in a very deep way, in a public way. We need to appeal to some other principle for making decisions about these long-term questions like conservation and sustainability. We can't ask a well-being approach to do all the work. In fact, I think for selling policy, it may also be a rhetorical mistake to tell people to worry about the end of the world when we're worried about the end of the week. So how do we get around that? Instead, I think we should focus on the near-term well-being benefits that may be associated with long-run investments when we're justifying them. But ultimately, we need to use other moral principles, or at least other rationale, to make those decisions about long-run stuff. And so I need to wrap up, and so I'm going to have to curtail my answer for what that looks like, I suppose. So that's my modified version of this picture, but I want to have at least mentioned the third, practicalities. So I'm going to jump some slides here about existential risks, and here's my answer. Well, here's the 1 slide version of my answer to what sustainability, how we incorporate sustainability, is that we have a bunch of constraints, and the justification is essentially a conservationist one to minimize the variance of the observable variance of complex systems. And within those constraints, we maximize life satisfaction, maximize well-being. And so we're not trying to make trade-offs. We have different rationale that are part of our constitutions and identities. And lastly, let me blaze through some of these other practicalities that might make things difficult, which is that, well, I've mentioned already, we have an information aggregation problem. We have a causal identification problem still in the data. So I'm sort of assuming that we are going to get strong enough knowledge that it's really actionable. I've mentioned this already. I've mentioned government silos, but there's getting from where we are now to where people are doing more with those frameworks that I showed you, because those frameworks are still all window dressing, even though they are getting a lot of attention. That's a lot of capacity building and turf connecting, synergizing across departments and so on. And it may also, I'm learning here from Mark Fabian on this last one, but you know, it may be that the whole idea of having a very narrow rationale that everyone needs to incorporate into their budgets and their justifications and their program evaluations, unless it really is feasible and productive, it may be unproductive. It may be a distraction and stop people from doing the normal good work of common sense policy making and making difficult discretion choices over complex trade-offs. Okay, let me stop without speaking about that slide. I'll leave it up. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chris. So everyone, we have about 15 minutes. We can open up the discussion now. You can raise your hands, virtual hands, and ask Chris directly, or you can write in the chat. It looks like I'm not seeing anyone just yet. I did have a quick question, Chris. So you went over that last bit very quickly on minimizing the variance of ecological uncertainty and then maximizing subjective well-being. Maybe you can just restate that quickly. So it was a couple slides back. I want to catch that. Okay, I think it was.
I mean, here's my whole system.
Yep.
Basically, all this stuff on the left is more or less academic. So this is answering the question, building up knowledge about what it is that makes for better lives. And then on the right is the policy-making machine. I do talk to policymakers recently in life, but you know, this is very academic. But this one other thing I'd like to emphasize here, which is that this blue circle, this is all the knowledge about what happens if we invest in education of an individual, if we invest in policing differently, if we build a bridge, you know, any government investment has a whole sequence of objective outcomes and returns to investment that will come down the line. They've got nothing to do with our field of understanding human well-being. So then there's translation from these objective outcomes in the future. So this knowledge here is also in many governments just not well developed. And it's probably a much bigger scope of questions that need to be answered there than our field. But you know, once you have some future objective outcomes that you predict from a policy, proposed policy, then you can translate that into life satisfaction. Now, your question was, well, so then what am I saying about this stuff? Well, it's that the set of policies that we consider and that we optimize in this way, that we make decisions in this cost-benefit way, the type 3 approach, that can simply be constrained by the Constitution as it is now. And the way to deal with really squirrely problems like, well, pick on climate change again, it's a bit too easy and too difficult an example maybe, but rather than what I characterize crudely as spending 3 decades seeing whether we can get the utility function parameters better constrained so that we know what the right price of carbon is. The other approach to all of that is, instead of optimizing, to realize that this is a system that's changing fast and it's a complex system, and so a precautionary approach or a conservation approach says, let's try and slow that change down. And that's got nothing to do with optimizing well-being. It's something you can put into place with constraints. Now, in climate change, there's huge externalities internationally, so we can't do that anyway. But for other kinds of conservation, we can, which are the subject of national government policy, we can put constraints on. So, you know, and that's the kind of, in fact, many constitutional constraints are of this form, that we don't want to allow certain kind of abuses or low enough wages or whatever else, and allow those to be parameters in our optimization. We're constraining them because we think the system might fall apart, you know, without them. In fact, the political constraints of a constitution are also of the same kind. we don't necessarily have the optimal system of government or something, but it's such a complex system that we're not changing that. We're not trying to optimize over it.
I have a follow-up question to, I think partially deal with, the concern that Mark Fabian has. It seems like, ultimately we should not be making a decision based on a scalar. So we don't have to reduce all of this information into scalars. So you can, come up with the well-being costs and benefits to inform policymakers who can then use that information, but they don't have to reduce it to a scalar. And you may be able to relatedly, derive scenarios going forward for what the world would look like, let's say with ecological constraints and without ecological constraints, and in scenarios, right? So because there is uncertainty, and then you can get a range of well-being costs, maybe. Would you argue that this is a good thing? And then that can help the policymaker get a sense of how large the costs and benefits are of different policies.
So I think you may have asked two questions. So I'm not actually sure what the first scenario of giving policymakers the evaluations based on subjective well-being, but then not having them convert things to a scalar or something. I mean, ultimately, so I by the way, argued against the scalar in a way that I have thought about, unlike, I channeled Mark Fabian's objection a little bit there without having thought enough about that yet, but I'm also saying that we should be talking about distributions, not scalars. As for the second part, I mean, I've simplified things here I've abstracted things to say, well, there's things that we can call constraints, and then we can optimize within. Of course, there's a continuum of things where we actually have enough knowledge that we can start to talk about some of the costs and benefits of very long-term investments or meddling in complex systems. So it's easier to talk about the more extreme cases. I mean, if you say look at something like the erosion of topsoil or depletion of an aquifer, or emitting certain pollutants and novel chemicals or something like this, we're not really going to be able to do good cost-benefit calculations on really long-run outcomes for some of those things. I don't know if those are the best examples, but those are things that we could put constraints on. I mean, I would say similar to, I don't know about growth boundaries, the way they've been implemented, but that for urban growth boundaries, but that kind of thing can be accepted once it's just said this, here's a rationale for it, and then people will innovate perfectly well within it. Whereas if we say we are going to try and find the right level before we start regulating it, before we start controlling it, capping it, say, we'll never really get there.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. We have a question for you in the chat. This is from Johnson. So he says, thank you. You were a bit general on the role of life satisfaction in selecting indicators and indicator weights, and he would like to know a little bit more about that. How best can we do this in practice?
So the easy answer is that if you have enough information to do the third step of actually being able to do cost benefit, then you can, that means you have enough confidence and depth of knowledge to really rank and quantify the effect of different domains, different circumstances in people's lives in their overall well-being, so that you know what outcomes ultimately should be in there, at least at the individual level, and what community supports and public goods and so on are supporting those. Maybe that's too vague as well, but then a softer version of that, which is just the part you're talking about, which is selecting indicators, is that you have some knowledge, enough to at least include and put a soft weight on, but it's fuzzier, I suppose. So, this is why things like trust and social cohesiveness and stability and relationships and measures of exclusion, or measures of inclusion, I should say, are in these frameworks already, is because the research being done on life satisfaction screams out, oh, these things actually turn out to be hugely important, even as compared with a lot of the other objective things that objective outcomes that governments typically focused on. So we can give numbers for those, but I would say that we're not confident enough to, or we're also missing this blue box here, so that we can't necessarily do all the cost benefit, but we can say, in fact, that's one way to answer the question, is to say that we can talk about the importance of different things for individual life satisfaction before we have enough knowledge to actually go from policy levers all the way there. So we can start to say these are the important outcomes that we need to be focusing more attention on because they seem to loom large in explaining differences and changes in life satisfaction. So that's just a fuzzier stage of knowledge. But I'd actually like to hear more from Johnson, because I'm not sure I addressed that question well.
Johnson, feel free to unmute yourself if you'd like to follow
up. Sure, Chris, you do. Thanks a lot.
Oh, it sounds like okay. So you answered the question then. Okay. So no follow-up, Johnson. I have another question, and everyone, please feel free, raise your hands or write in the chat. So moral hazard, Chris, or strategic responses. So if we are to tell people that the goal is to improve subjective well-being, do you think people are going to strategically respond to, ultimately change their, let's say, the resources oriented towards them?
It's very difficult to respond strategically to the life satisfaction question, because to be strategic, you have to know what the lever is that's of interest. And life satisfaction, in principle, is affected by everything. So, you might say it's strategic just to be unhappy, but but I'm not sure that that's really a motivating force if someone's not asking you the question that we don't ask typically, which is what is it that is making you happy, or what would make you happy, right? So as I always point out, what's profound about this field is that in some sense we don't care what somebody thinks what makes for a satisfying life, because individuals are only the experts about their own experience, and we have enough data now that we have a better confidence, better answers from asking other people who have experienced different things about how good their life was. And so we actually, in many cases, can have better prediction of how your life would be like under those circumstances than your own intuition. So I am worried about people being sort of more familiar with what the distribution looks like and having normed answers or something. But again, that's got to be somehow a strong influence compared to all the other influences on life satisfaction, which there are many, and it's a very, very noisy measure. And yet what we know is that despite all of those, despite it being so broadly defined, subjective, etc., we can extract those marginal effects with great confidence when we do analysis. So I don't think that's an overwhelming concern. I mean, there's so many things about life satisfaction that seem like they will make the data unuseful or deceptive that we have overcome when we push against it. So I suspect, I don't know how that would play out, but I suspect that's in that category.
Thank you. It's helpful. So we have a question in the chat from Ashley B. So he says, thanks, Chris. You described life satisfaction as a positive goal, but I wonder whether there isn't a paradox for positive policy. In our personal lives and for teams and organizations, positive goals are motivators. But for governments, blame is the currency of the realm, which makes governments more motivated by negative goals.
Yeah, I mean, that certainly feels like the description now. If you're a historian, maybe you're talking about a longer period than the current disastrous state of public polarization in politics. But I mean, I don't know that it needs to be like that. By the way, I wanted to say there's nothing that motivates people like a shared goal, a shared positive goal, but actually shared negative goals motivate groups also very much in terms of cohering. So I don't, this is maybe an interesting question about what could be, but I don't think it matters. I think what matters is what we want. And so I think we want those positive goals, and we also want to cohere around positive goals, not around ostracization and out-group xenophobic kind of cohering motivations. So, I mean, in Canada, the thing that we're trying to do, so this government has innovated creating this quality of life framework. It's going to be a generation before it's actually really having strong influences on policy decisions that get made. And the question is how to even make it last for beyond one administration. And so I think the obvious answer is that those institutions that hold the knowledge and that are able to evaluate potential policies and evaluate programs in terms of well-being outcomes, they need to be in the public civil society domain as well as government. And they need to be entrenched, the appetite for accountability to human experience needs to be institutionalized sufficiently, again, outside government, into civil society, such that the next government doesn't really have much of a choice about unraveling such a framework. So I don't know. I think this is. I think it's a big deal. I also like to say that never in the history of our species have we had this knowledge about what it is that makes for a good life in the quantitative or confident way that we do with modern knowledge. I mean, that might be a really big shift. That might be a really big shift in the direction that civilization goes, depending on where following that trail of evidence-based policymaking leads us. So I don't know, the fact that I don't think what you're describing is necessary, immutable.
And a follow-up, you had said that using subjective well-being as a headline indicator changes the tone, and maybe you have a cultural shift both in government and civil society as a response, moving more towards positive, a more positive orientation. So the question I would have then is, is in fact that what you think, and how long does it take? Does it take a generation? And maybe we don't know the answer, but is that what I meant to understand?
I mean, I think I'm out of my depth there, but I think it's a generation. I mean, I think everything takes a generation. I remember hearing long ago that if you wanted to be able to take the kind of keep the kind of administrative records that are accepted in Sweden, it would take a generation of sort of steadfast building up the right kind of trust in, say, Canada, for people to be willing to accept that kind of record keeping. Now, that was maybe before the era where corporations have more data on us, so expectations may have changed. But yeah, building trust takes a generation. I don't know. Maybe that's just not my expertise, right? I mean, I think probably a lot of our expectations about how the system works get set early on. So I don't know how to get there except build, like any movement, actually build up the civil society institutions, as I mentioned. I'm an enormous fan of what works well-being in the UK, as being that outside government voice. And, they're just like constantly ringing that bell. Yeah.
Very good. That makes sense. We have a question from Levi, who says, in your presentation, you mentioned the well-being policies of democratic governments. Should we be more concerned about working with non-democratic countries or those with a recent history of human rights abuses? How should we approach working with them or understanding their well-being policies? When I ask this, I specifically have in mind the United Arab Emirates or Bhutan.
Oh, again, it's above my pay grade. I mean, I think subjective well-being is insidious in the sense that you can be a benevolent autocrat and do everything I said, but if you go down that path, you're going to find probably that people like ideas, kinds of freedom that might not. Well, again, actually, I don't even want to make that statement. I'm not sure, but I suspect that you will end up, finding that people are better off under freedoms. Now, if you can keep them somehow, if there are ways to counteract those effects, then as a hardcore subjective well-being advocate, I would say maybe that's okay. But most likely, if you follow the evidence as an autocrat, you're going to move towards systems that look democratic.
Great.
I'm not sure that's a complete answer to all of those questions, but that's part of it. One more thing to say, I mean, I could say something about UAE and Bhutan. I mean, they both have interesting histories here, but actually, more generally, I did mention the examples of governments I gave were for Anglophone countries, and that's a cause of great concern for me, right? So there's this movement to broaden conceptions of well-being pan-culturally, not just conceptions, but measures, make sure that we've got all the knowledge that's out there from different cultures about how to measure. And this is an enormous issue within Canada. We have a lot of Indigenous people, including many First Nations, who have different knowledge systems about what a good life is, and I think they're very complementary or similar to what we've learned recently in the West, after being very focused on a sort of particular conception about what we're pursuing. But those are difficult conversations at the moment in Canada to try and think about how to have something that is either integrative or differentiated.
Thanks. So, okay, I have a response there, but to move on, Johnson had a response to your earlier point. So he says, indeed fuzzy as you term it. So, this is related to the weights. And then you gave some powerful hints on how to make this practical. But in general, he's saying he agrees that we need to look more at the distributions and not just the means and averages. So you can probably see the comment there. And Joe Sergi is following up as well, asking, if we should also use domain satisfaction variables to complement life satisfaction, and this may allow us to generate indicator weights. What do you think?
So on the first, by the way, I mean, because talk is cheap, and again, I'm an academic, I'm suggesting that statistical agencies stop publishing means of things like income and life satisfaction. I just don't know what they mean. I mean, as a measure of production, well, there's some use. I mean, mostly I think of GDP as a measure of war-fighting ability of a country, right? It's if I was to turn my production system towards making arms, how powerful would my country be? But anyway, certainly for individual experiences like subjective well-being, maybe just the public is ready to look at a distribution, stare at a distribution, and ask all the natural questions you get from staring. Oh, look, there's people down there, or there's people up there. I wonder what's going on. So yeah, we need to, and in some sense, on the statistical side, our focus on means is a matter of 1970s computer technology. We maybe that's a bit strong, but we should be thinking more carefully about modeling distributions in a meaningful way. And for Joe's question about domains, I don't know what to say there. I feel like I'd have nothing more than one person's opinion on that. I don't like domain satisfactions. If they're there, they're always interesting to look at, but I have even less understanding of them than I do of a overarching life satisfaction. I think that's something somebody can feel, but when you ask about a domain satisfaction, it becomes, there's multiple levels of undefined things there, I guess, and it just makes more sense to me to be measuring objective outcomes to do with a domain, and then see how they affect people's overall life experience. But that's sort of me being shy and not understanding it partly. Certainly, local governments especially love to have satisfaction with services, satisfaction with domains of related more closely to government policies and programs. And governments, of course, want to know about voting intentions as well, which sounds like a subjective well-being measure. So I don't know.
Thanks, Chris. So we have already pushed to 10 minutes after, and we have a question from Paul Rogers. I think this may be the last question. Maybe both of you keep it brief, and maybe if there's one last burning question, we'll go for it.
Yeah, thanks, Kelsey. On this subjective measure of other domains, I take your point, Chris. But from where I'm coming from, and I find a lot of this discourse quite difficult to follow because I'm not a well-being scientist, but offering people the opportunity to measure their satisfaction across the well-being domains, the value of that, as I see it, is that it is probably the best way of familiarizing residents, citizens, of what the domains are and how significant they are in the well-being agenda. So it's a method of creating, as local government people have said to me, it's a method of creating traction for the well-being agenda to be implemented at a local level. So I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
I don't know. I think your words probably stand fine without my thoughts. That makes sense. I mean, but maybe it might help me to hear an example of a domain that you have in mind. I mean, certainly, satisfaction with a particular service sounds different from a domain that we know.
Sorry.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say the ones that are embraced in the Canadian dashboard that you illustrated a while ago in the presentation.
Oh, those as domains. I see. So we don't have we don't have domain satisfaction data in the dashboard, but you're saying we have domains, and so you could ask about how happy you are with all of those. Yeah. I mean, if I said how happy are you with the environment? Well, anyway, your point is good, yeah. and there's a question. Well, I guess I haven't really talked about transition, but there are people who thought also more about what is the process by which we build up the capacity in the institutions and also the demand from the public for all of this stuff. So yeah, I mean, I think actually, in terms of local government and maybe central governments too, just asking more questions, getting more subjective data and responses, feedback, suggestions from people in general is a good thing. And it's surprising to me now that we still don't have frequent, two-way communication with our governments. I've finally succumbed to a cell phone, and I think it makes sense if once in a while the government is asking me what I think about something, and that's not happening.
Thanks.
Thank you.
If I may, Chris, one of the things that you presented with the new OECD guidelines is that more than 80% of these countries are implementing well-being frameworks. I think it was even higher, 80% was doing it maybe on an annual basis. So it's not just the Anglophone countries, and they are frequently engaging in public consultations to set up those frameworks. And you think of New Zealand, who's really engaging the Maori. So I think that there is something positive to take away from that. 70% have developed a national framework. Okay, so it was 70%. And we have Israel, Mexico, Italy, so not just Japan's in here, very different cultural experiences included in these, and they're often engaging with using public consultations to set up these frameworks.
That's right. I guess my comments about the cultural differences really pertains to the scalar and a particular scalar, right? Okay. So I think having a well-being framework is a fairly low bar in some sense, but in that, indicate, well, regardless of whether it's a low bar, you can have a well-being framework which does not privilege life satisfaction as the overarching measure that captures everything that one grew up valuing.
Okay, thank you. So if you have any final words, otherwise I think we'll shut it down here. I appreciate very much your time with us today and the insightful discussion.
And to you and to everyone who came, thanks for all the great discussion.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you, everyone. We'll shut it down
Thank
here.
you. Thanks, everyone. Thank you.